The first crash of scandal struck like a hammer across Lady Clara Whitmore's fragile world. She arrived at the ballroom of Somerset Manor not as a bride, not yet, but as the object of whispered ridicule, and the murmurs clung to her like winter's frost. Candles flickered along gilded walls, casting long shadows that seemed to mock her with every step. The chatter of silk skirts and laughter cascaded around her ears, sharp and metallic, slicing through her careful composure. She drew a trembling breath, forcing her chin higher, though her pulse betrayed the tremor of shame. Every eye that lingered too long felt like an accusation, a tally of her weight, her posture, her very presence. And yet, within that crushing hum of judgment, she held a defiance that no society could measure, a quiet dignity that even whispered condemnation could not erase. Her gown, pale blue and trimmed with delicate lace, was modest, carefully stitched by the hands of her mother and the best seamstress they could afford. It was, by her standards, beautiful, by theirs, insufficient. Guests, already drunk on wine and gossip, smirked behind their jeweled fans, and one young debutante, with cheeks painted in blush and mischief, tilted her head and whispered something that reached Clara's ears like a poisoned arrow. Clara clenched the folds of her dress, wishing invisibility were an attainable gift. She was acutely aware of the titled men whose eyes drifted past her as if she were a shadow to be ignored, and the women whose cruel smiles sharpened with every movement she made. Her heart constricted, and yet she moved forward, each step a battle waged against the tremor that threatened to betray her pride. Lord Nathaniel Ashbourne, newly crowned Earl of Wynthorpe, observed her from across the room with a stillness that both unsettled and fascinated her. His expression was composed, almost severe, and yet there was a measure of curiosity that flickered in the depths of his grey eyes. He was a man of reputation and station, his pride and reticence woven tightly around him like the tailored coat that clung to his broad shoulders. Rumors whispered that he was unapproachable, proud, and perhaps even unfeeling. That night, however, Clara felt a subtle disturbance in the air between them, as though he alone could perceive the fragile tremors of her soul beneath the polite facade she had perfected over years of practice. Her mother, Lady Whitmore, tugged lightly at her elbow, nudging her forward with the mechanical politeness of a woman trained in society's ruthless theater. "My dear, present yourself with grace," she murmured, a hint of desperation buried beneath her velvet tones. The words should have reassured Clara, but instead they only reminded her of the stakes, a marriage of convenience, of financial necessity, of social survival. This union, arranged to preserve the family's dwindling fortune, would be the theater of her public scrutiny, and the silent weighing of her worth would continue from this night onward until the walls of Somerset Manor enclosed them both. The orchestra struck a chord, sweeping through the marble floors and gilded ceilings, and Clara was offered the first dance, a thinly veiled trial by fire. The young men she had once admired for their easy charm now stepped aside, and she felt the sting of rejection with an intensity sharpened by the eyes of the assembly. One gentleman, barely 21, smiled politely, then averted his gaze with exaggerated disinterest. A murmur rose, some called her the Earl's consolation, others whispered of her ample figure with the cruel precision of surgeons, dissecting her self-esteem under the guise of polite observation. Her stomach nodded, her cheeks warmed, and yet she held herself with the tight-lipped control of a heroine forged in the fires of quiet humiliation. Nathaniel approached her at last, as though drawn not by obligation but by something deeper, a curiosity that refused to be denied. His steps were measured, deliberate, and each movement seemed to command the attention of the room despite his silence. When he reached her, he inclined his head in a gesture both polite and irrevocably deliberate. "Lady Whitmore," he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying the weight of authority and the faintest hint of something unreadable, "the evening is bright with company, is it not?" The words, simple as they were, struck her with the paradoxical warmth of recognition, for in his tone, there was no mockery, no judgment, only observation and a hint of acknowledgement that she existed beyond the cruel ledger of society's estimation. Their eyes met, briefly, and she sensed a barrier, not entirely of his making, and yet something fragile stirred in the space between them. He withdrew with a small nod, leaving her to navigate the gauntlet of whispered assessments and imperceptible sneers. She moved again, slower now, aware that each footfall was a statement of endurance, each careful breath a challenge to the invisible tribunal that deemed her unworthy. She noticed the minor cruelties, a servant's hesitant glance, a friend's hesitating smile, a distant cousin's smirk sharpened by envy. Every subtle gesture became a battle, every whispered syllable a test of her composure, until she felt the weight of the room pressing upon her chest like the first storm of winter. The night stretched interminably. Glasses clinked with feigned delight, music swelled and receded in a rhythm both seductive and merciless, and Clara found herself standing at the margins, her hands folded, her heart throbbing. In the corner, she glimpsed Nathaniel once more, detached and unreadable, the very embodiment of a man trained to judge and to endure, yet somehow hinting at a vulnerability she could not yet name. Her own heart seemed to echo that vulnerability, a fragile resonance, a whisper of hope buried beneath layers of shame. She longed for connection, for understanding, for a gesture that would pierce the veil of her isolation, and she felt, faintly, that perhaps such a gesture might come, though when or how remained a mystery beyond her grasp. Finally, the hour grew late, and guests departed in their carriages, leaving Clara standing alone on the marble floor, the echoes of laughter and gossip fading into the silence of Somerset Manor. Her gown rustled softly with each step toward the side corridor, and she allowed herself a single shiver, unobserved, a testament to the storm of emotion roiling within her. The candles dimmed, leaving her in a fragile glow, and she approached the guest chamber that would be her bedroom for the first night as a bride, though the title was as hollow as the echoes of the ballroom. Her pulse quickened at the thought that the man she would marry, the newly minted earl, had not yet appeared to greet her, to offer a word or a gesture, to bridge the distance carved by duty and expectation. She set her hand upon the polished doorframe and drew in a breath of trembling anticipation. Outside, the world was silent, indifferent, and inside, Somerset Manor held its own secrets, shadows and whispers, judgment and expectation, beauty and cruelty intertwined. And in that hush, in that moment poised between hope and despair, Clara understood that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer merely a girl of gentle manners and generous heart, she was the subject of scrutiny, the bride of an unknown future, the quiet battlefield upon which dignity and ridicule would clash. And somewhere, in the vast stillness of the manor, he waited, whether with indifference, with judgment, or with something far more profound, she could not yet know. Her fingers lingered upon the door handle. She could hear only her own heartbeat. A drumbeat in the hush, each pulse a question, each breath a fragile prayer. She stepped forward, and in that step lay the delicate promise of all that was to come, the possibility of tenderness, of defiance, of love that would emerge from the shadows of ridicule. The candle beside the bed flickered once more, and as its light wavered across the chamber, she realized, with the quiet ache of anticipation, that tonight would mark not an end, but the beginning of a story written in courage and longing, a story that had already begun to unfold in the hush of Somerset Manor, beneath the weight of expectation, and just beyond the reach of judgment. The first whisper of scandal struck like a lightning bolt through the hushed corridors of Somerset Manor, rattling the fragile calm that Clara had fought so hard to maintain. News from London had arrived on the Morning Post, a folded sheet trembling in the hands of a breathless maid. Clara's name had been mentioned, unkindly, in the Society Gazette, a cruel caricature of the plump Countess of Wynthorpe, accompanied by inked illustrations that mocked her frame and the gentleness of her expression. She held the paper with white-knuckled fingers, her knuckles pressing into the folds of the fine lace of her gloves, as if to squeeze the words into nothingness. The chill of outrage and humiliation crept into her chest, settling beside the quiet ache of loneliness that had been her companion since the ball. She could not help but imagine the laughter of those who read the words aloud in private salons, the clicking of fans, the muffled giggles that traced her every step. Nathaniel, for all his stoicism, had learned of the publication as well. He arrived that morning in the library, the weight of duty heavy upon him, the sharp edges of authority etched into his composed features. His gaze fell upon her, not with judgment, but with an unspoken acknowledgment of the injustice she endured. "This is intolerable," he said, voice low, threaded with a rare tremor of emotion. He placed a hand upon the table, steadying himself against the swell of indignation that rose like a tide. "You are valued far beyond the reach of these trifling remarks." Clara, startled by the warmth of his conviction, felt a flicker of something she had long denied herself, hope. But it was a fragile ember, fragile enough to be extinguished by a single misstep, a single careless word. The manor itself seemed to sigh in sympathy. Its walls, high and imposing, bore the legacy of generations, yet even they could not shield her from the intrusions of rumor and ridicule. Clara moved through its silent halls, her skirts rustling like soft whispers, every footfall a question, every breath a struggle against despair. She wandered into the neglected rose garden, its winter-hardened branches clinging stubbornly to life, and paused to run her fingers along the thorns, imagining the resilience required to flourish where care had long been absent. It was here, amid the frost-hardened soil and the echoes of solitude, that she allowed herself the faintest trace of solace, the thought that beauty could survive neglect, that kindness could endure even in the harshest of climates. Nathaniel appeared at the garden gate, a figure of deliberate motion against the grey light of a morning clouded by mist. "I trust you find the roses welcome company," he said, a subtle attempt at levity threading through his otherwise solemn tone. Clara's lips quivered in a smile she did not trust, and he allowed himself the briefest hint of amusement before returning to the air of composed authority that cloaked him like armor. He had begun to leave tokens of attention, small gestures that spoke more than words, a book of poetry left upon her writing desk, a silk scarf draped over the back of a chair, a sprig of rosemary tucked into her letter drawer. Each act was a delicate intrusion upon her self-imposed isolation, a question posed in quiet terms, asking whether she would receive it, and what it might mean. Society, ever vigilant, would not leave matters so privately reconciled. Invitations arrived for the London season, whispers of gatherings where eyes would turn and tongues would wag with renewed fervor. Clara felt the dread coil in her stomach as the world outside pressed its expectations upon her fragile sense of self. Yet Nathaniel remained a quiet sentinel, a figure who, through his measured silences and deliberate movements, communicated a loyalty and protectiveness that startled her with its clarity. He would appear at meals, standing behind her chair, correcting minor insults with a word or a glance, shielding her dignity with a manner that was both discreet and irrevocable. The subtle defiance did not go unnoticed by the household. Servants watched him with awe, minor relatives with suspicion, and Clara herself with a growing, hesitant admiration. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Lady Haversham, a cousin distant in blood but close in envy. She carried a smile sharp as a dagger, her eyes scanning Clara with the precision of a sculptor judging clay. "I hear the London papers have been most descriptive," she said, her tone a whisper masked as polite inquiry. Clara's heart constricted. She met the gaze evenly, forcing calm into her posture, yet her pulse betrayed the tremor within. Nathaniel's presence was immediate, a protective shadow, as he inclined his head slightly. "I trust you will find no pleasure in the suffering of another," he said, voice firm but devoid of theatricality. Lady Haversham's eyes narrowed, and she withdrew with a murmured farewell, leaving behind a silence weighted with unspoken threats. Clara exhaled, the tension of the encounter slowly ebbing, yet the taste of vigilance lingered, a reminder that her trials were far from concluded. That evening, as candlelight pooled in the drawing-room, Clara sat in quiet reflection, her fingers tracing the delicate embroidery of her gown. Each stitch seemed a testament to endurance, each thread a measure of fortitude. She felt the duality of her position sharply, trapped in the expectations of society, yet slowly, imperceptibly, recognized by the one whose opinion mattered most. Nathaniel entered, silent as the mist, and placed upon the table a small box wrapped in fine ribbon. She opened it with hesitant fingers to reveal a delicate chain of gold, a single charm of a rose in bloom. "For resilience," he said simply, eyes steady upon hers, "and for courage in the face of ridicule." Clara's throat tightened. The gesture was modest, yet it conveyed a depth of attention, a recognition of her inner life that few dared to acknowledge. For the first time since the arrival of London's whispered judgments, she allowed herself to feel the fragile stirring of trust. The scandal had arrived, sharp and unrelenting, yet in its shadow, a quiet sanctuary had been offered, not in words, but in the simple acknowledgement of presence and care. The garden, the book, the rose chain, these were small tokens of a growing connection, the delicate architecture of intimacy laid brick by brick in the midst of a storm of judgment. She felt her heart, cautious and wary, begin to lean toward hope, even as the world outside continued its ceaseless tally of flaws and virtue alike. Night descended upon Somerset Manor, drawing a curtain of darkness over the rose garden, the corridors, and the chambers. Clara lingered by the window, looking toward the path Nathaniel had taken that morning, wondering whether his vigilance would extend beyond mere gestures, whether it could translate into a steady presence that would carry her through the social gauntlet that awaited. She thought of the Gazette, of Lady Haversham, of the whispers that had haunted every footstep since her arrival, and yet, beneath the fear and humiliation, she sensed a fragile current of possibility. Nathaniel, silent and deliberate, had begun to carve a space for her dignity, an unspoken promise that the trials of ridicule might be tempered by loyalty, by attention, by the quiet emergence of admiration. And as she closed the window, feeling the chill of the evening slip across her shoulders, she knew the world outside had not yet forgiven her, nor had it changed. But inside, within the subtle warmth of Somerset Manor, a small flame had been lit, a flame of recognition, of care, of connection that might yet grow. In that fragile light, she allowed herself a single thought, a single quiet hope. Perhaps the man who had observed her with such reserved attention might yet prove that dignity and kindness could flourish even amid the harshest of society's storms. The storm arrived with a fury that rattled the very bones of Somerset Manor, a drumbeat of rain and wind that set the windows trembling and the ancient shutters clanging like distant bells of warning. Clara had never felt the house so alive with both menace and possibility, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and burning wood, the very atmosphere vibrating with unspoken tension. She had wandered into the library, seeking refuge from the relentless gossip and the sharp sting of London's mockery, only to find the room empty, save for the occasional flicker of firelight across polished oak. And then he appeared, Nathaniel, stepping from shadow into the amber glow, his coat damp, hair slightly disheveled, and eyes carrying a weight that made her pulse hitch in recognition. "Lady Whitmore," he said, voice low, nearly swallowed by the storm, yet charged with an intensity that made the silence between them impossible to ignore. "May I sit?" It was not a question of courtesy alone. There was a gravity in his tone that implied both urgency and vulnerability, and she nodded, her own voice caught somewhere between propriety and the desperate desire to speak freely. The fire crackled, a soft accompaniment to the wind that moaned through the eaves, and for a moment, the manor seemed suspended between time and tempest, a private world where only the two of them existed. She sat, stiff-backed and tense, yet unable to tear her eyes from him, noticing the subtle way his hands flexed at his sides, the taut lines of his jaw, the shadow beneath his gray eyes that spoke of burdens hidden beneath layers of duty and pride. Nathaniel's gaze softened as he drew a chair nearer, the floorboards groaning under the weight of a confession yet unspoken. "I have not been honest with you," he said finally, each word deliberate, measured, as though testing the fragile ground of trust before stepping fully upon it. Clara's heart stuttered, a delicate tremor that mirrored the flickering flame. "I married you, Lady Whitmore, not from pity, not from obligation alone." Her breath caught. She had known duty dictated much of their union, had expected politeness and restraint, had prepared herself for the cold calculus of alliances and estates. And yet here he was, revealing something more, a truth unguarded by formality or pretense. She could scarcely trust the warmth in his voice, but she wanted, with every fragile fiber of her being, to believe it. "Then, why?" she whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer, almost afraid to betray the tremor of hope that had begun to creep into her chest. Nathaniel looked away, tracing the rim of the fireplace with a fingertip, as though seeking guidance from the flickering shadows. "Years ago," he began, his voice quieter, "I saw you in London, defending a servant from ridicule. You stood without fear, with kindness and dignity that left an impression I could not ignore. I promised myself then, that if ever opportunity allowed, I would know the measure of your heart, beyond the superficial measures of society." His eyes returned to hers, holding steady in a gaze that made the world outside irrelevant, the storm outside nothing but a distant roar. "I married you because I recognized a soul of rare courage, and because I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that you might one day allow me to prove the regard I feel." Tears blurred her vision, but she did not reach for a handkerchief. She allowed herself to feel the exquisite ache of being seen, truly seen, by a man whose station and reputation could have rendered her insignificant. I have spent my life measured against others' expectations," she said, voice trembling. "And yet, in your eyes, I feel acknowledged, not for appearance, but for the one part of me that I feared would always be overlooked." Nathaniel's lips twitched in the faintest semblance of a smile, a subtle break in the fortress of restraint that surrounded him. They drew closer in the quiet warmth of the library, the firelight painting their faces with amber softness, shadows dancing across expressions too long constrained by formality. Clara felt the tension between them, a delicate balance of yearning and hesitation, of propriety and the pull of something wholly human, wholly necessary. He extended a hand, hesitated, and then took hers, his fingers gentle yet unyielding, grounding her in the certainty of the moment. "I did not marry you to command your obedience, Lady Whitmore," he said softly, "but to share life, in whatever measure you will allow me." The storm outside intensified, a symphony of rain and wind that mirrored the sudden surge of courage within her. She met his gaze fully, seeing not just the authority of an earl, but the vulnerability of a man who had risked judgment and reputation for a chance at genuine connection. Her pulse quickened, and for the first time since the ball, since the cruel sketches in the Gazette, since whispered ridicule had shadowed her every step, she felt the stirrings of trust, of hope, of something far more profound than the polite respect of social convention. A subtle laugh, half disbelief, half relief, escaped her lips. "Then you care for me," she murmured, almost as if speaking aloud might shatter the fragile magic of the confession. Nathaniel's grip tightened fractionally, a silent affirmation, and he allowed himself the smallest smile, the first breach of his composure that Clara had witnessed. "I do," he admitted, voice as soft as the flickering light, "and I will not let the world diminish it. Nor will I allow you to doubt it, no matter the voices outside these walls." For several moments, they sat in silence, letting the words settle, letting the storm rage beyond the windows, letting the acknowledgement of truth bind them closer than any formal ceremony could. The distance that had existed between them, forged of assumptions, etiquette, and fear, began to crumble in the quiet intimacy of shared recognition. Clara's heart, long shuttered against vulnerability, open just enough to glimpse the possibility of love, tentative but real, a fragile flame that might yet grow into something enduring. But the quiet was not eternal. From beyond the library door, a shadow moved, the familiar, calculating figure of Lady Havisham, peering through the slight opening, her expression sharp with envy and intrigue. She had witnessed the subtle unfolding, the connection between them, and her lips curved with the satisfaction of a scandal yet to be unleashed. Clara's pulse stuttered, the warmth of the confession meeting the chill of impending scrutiny, and she realized, with a pang both thrilling and terrifying, that the world outside had not relented, that the storm was not merely outside the windows but poised to enter the fragile sanctuary they had created. In that moment, as Nathaniel squeezed her hand and the firelight painted them in gold and shadow, Clara understood that revelation and danger were entwined, that love and society's cruelty could not be separated, and that the next act of this story would demand courage greater than she had ever imagined. The hall erupted in a ripple of shocked gasps the instant Clara entered, her skirts whispering over polished marble, her posture poised though her heart quaked beneath the weight of every eye upon her. The London Assembly was at its most vicious that evening, a congregation of gilded voices and sparkling eyes eager to feast upon scandal, and all attention now turned toward the Countess of Wynthorpe. The Gazette's cruel sketches had already circulated, yet here she was, stepping into the grand hall of Buckingham House, resolute, despite the ache of ridicule clinging to her like a second skin. Every whisper seemed amplified, every glance sharpened by the glare of curiosity, envy, or derision. She felt the familiar sting, the long-familiar loneliness, as if the entire ton were poised to weigh her soul in the balance of appearance and propriety. Nathaniel appeared at her side, sudden and commanding, the embodiment of unshakable presence. His eyes, grey as the storm-laden sky over Somerset Manor months before, held steady upon the assembly, scanning for malice, for insult, for the faintest threat to the dignity of the woman beside him. The room seemed to contract around him, a tide of polite murmurs and clipped laughter faltering in the shadow of his authority. "Lady Whitmore," he murmured softly, as if only she could hear, "hold your grace, they will falter before it." His voice, low and controlled, carried a promise, he would not let the petty cruelty of others prevail. Clara's hand brushed briefly against his, and the contact, though slight, carried the weight of protection, the silent affirmation of a bond forged in shared endurance. Lady Havisham, ever vigilant, had ensured her position at the forefront of observation, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of anticipated triumph. She leaned toward a cluster of companions, her voice a delicate instrument of venom, every syllable a carefully measured slight. "Truly," she whispered, "one wonders how a figure so robust could hold the title of Countess without igniting laughter even among the less discerning." Clara, caught in the periphery of that calculated cruelty, felt the familiar squeeze of shame in her chest. She drew a quiet breath, steadying herself with the awareness that every glance, every smirk, every whispered syllable was a gauntlet she had already endured in the private corridors of Somerset Manor. The orchestra swelled with the opening measures of a waltz, and the room turned to see the first couple step forward. Nathaniel's hand was at her back, firm and commanding, and he guided her to the center of the hall with a quiet authority that silenced murmurs almost instantly. Whispers of doubt faltered when she met his gaze, the chill of ridicule met the warmth of conviction in his eyes. "Shall we dance, my lady?" he asked, voice soft yet carrying the weight of declaration. The room, accustomed to spectacle but unprepared for the display of unity and poise, fell silent, the notes of the music carrying an almost sacred tension as the couple moved together. Every step, every measured turn, was an act of defiance, an assertion of dignity in the face of the ton's merciless scrutiny. Clara felt the strength in Nathaniel's hand, the certainty in his guiding presence, and something within her shifted, fear yielded, however briefly, to the recognition that she was not alone. The laughter, the whispers, the subtle glances of judgment were muted beneath the gravity of their movement, beneath the magnetic authority of a man who refused to let her shame define her. The ballroom, ornate and gilded, became a stage not of ridicule but of revelation, each rotation of the waltz a subtle challenge to every sneer that had dared to punctuate her life. Then came the moment, the crescendo of propriety and courage intertwined. As a particularly sharp murmur traced across the assembly, Nathaniel halted the music, the notes suspended in the air, fragile as the quiet before a storm. He lifted Clara into his arms with effortless grace, her surprise mirrored in the widening of eyes around them. The assembly gasped, scandal and admiration mingling in the sharp intake of collective breath. "You are mocked for what is not yours to defend," he said, voice resonant, carrying through the hall with unassailable authority. "But I see you, not as others do, not as they would judge, but as you are. You are grace, you are courage, you are perfect to me." The room fell utterly silent, the clash of propriety and revelation hanging in the air like mist. Clara felt the warmth of his body, the unspoken devotion in the press of his chest against hers, and the flood of emotion that had been dammed by years of scrutiny and doubt finally broke free. Tears, unbidden, prickled her eyes, but she did not attempt to hide them. They were neither shame nor surrender but a tribute to the recognition she had long yearned for. Every hand in the room, even the most envious or incredulous, could see what she had already begun to understand, that dignity, courage, and love could converge to defy expectation. The whispers of society, Lady Haversham's cruel insinuations, and the Gazette's mocking sketches were rendered powerless in the radiance of that moment. Nathaniel set her down with care, his hands lingering for a heartbeat too long, a silent affirmation of devotion untainted by pretense. Clara, steadied by the gravity of his regard, allowed herself to meet the eyes of the assembly with quiet defiance. The storm that had raged in Somerset Manor months before seemed a distant memory, replaced by a storm of revelation, of truth, of love that would not bow to ridicule. Yet even in the brilliance of triumph, a shadow lingered. Outside the hall, the subtle shifts of intrigue and envy continued to stir, unseen but undeniable, a reminder that society's gaze, fickle and unrelenting, would not entirely relent. Clara felt the tension between public vindication and the precariousness of reputation, the realization that every gesture of courage would now be measured against whispers, and every triumph could invite renewed scrutiny. But for the first time, she understood that Nathaniel's devotion was unyielding, that the bond forged in private confessions had the power to withstand the harshest judgments. As the music resumed and the room tentatively exhaled, Clara sensed, with a thrill and an ache intertwined, that her life had irrevocably changed. The world outside, with all its envy and cruelty, would not vanish, but within the circle of Nathaniel's steadfast regard, she had found a sanctuary impervious to ridicule. And in the quiet of that realization, a question lingered, a promise yet unfulfilled: would society, relentless and unforgiving, allow such a story of tenderness and courage to flourish unimpeded, or would the shadows of jealousy and malice conspire to test them further? A single gunshot of thunder tore through the heavens, rattling Somerset Manor to its foundations and announcing the arrival of the storm in a fury that mirrored the tempest of emotion within Clara's heart. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, her skirts cascading in waves of silk, her palms pressed against the polished mahogany railing as she looked down into the hall below. Guests had gathered once more, summoned by the urgency of a letter-bearing scandal, and the murmur of whispers swelled into a chorus of anticipation and judgment. Yet this night, unlike all that had come before, Clara felt a strange and invigorating steadiness settle over her, as though the years of whispered ridicule, the Gazette's cruel caricatures, and Lady Haversham's relentless envy had been tempered into a reservoir of quiet courage. Nathaniel emerged from the shadows at the foot of the stairs, his grey eyes bright with purpose, a presence as commanding as the storm outside. He had anticipated the arrival of scandal, of confrontation, and his careful watch had not faltered. "My lady," he said, voice resonant, steady as the foundation of the manor itself, "tonight, let none dare measure your worth in whispers or paper, in judgment or envy. You stand here as I have always known you, resolute, dignified, and more radiant than they can ever imagine." Clara felt her pulse accelerate, the warmth of his words mingling with the thrill of defiance, each syllable a reinforcement of the bond that had grown between them, delicate yet unbreakable. The first wave of confrontation arrived in the form of a formal challenge from Lady Haversham, whose expression was both carefully composed and perilously sharp. "Surely," she began, her voice dripping with polite venom, "the Countess does not presume to command attention in such uncustomary fashion. The ton requires decorum, and yet, she seems to disregard it entirely." Clara, for the first time, allowed herself the freedom of unflinching gaze, meeting Lady Haversham's sharpness with the quiet authority that Nathaniel's steadfast presence had inspired. "I am aware of society's rules," she replied evenly, voice steady yet carrying a note of undeniable courage, "but I am also aware that dignity and kindness surpass the mere dictates of appearance and expectation." A hush fell over the hall, broken only by the wind's lament through the open windows. Nathaniel moved closer, taking her hand as if to lend both support and affirmation. "And I stand with her," he declared, voice ringing through the room, silencing all but the most incredulous of murmurs. "For I have seen her heart, and it is a measure far beyond any superficial scrutiny. To mock it, to belittle it, is to misunderstand the truest form of grace and courage." His words, deliberate and unwavering, acted like a bell tolling across the room, each strike breaking down the barriers of envy, each note resonating with the authority of truth. The assembly shifted uneasily, their collective breath caught between admiration and disbelief. Some turned their gaze inward, questioning their own judgments, while others simply recoiled at the undeniable clarity of what had been revealed, that Clara's worth was not to be measured by weight, fashion, or gossip, but by the strength, compassion, and dignity she carried in every gesture, every glance, every quiet act of courage. Even Lady Haversham faltered, the sharp edge of her malice blunted by the irrefutable presence of both Clara's poise and Nathaniel's steadfast defense. Nathaniel extended his hand to Clara, a gesture at once intimate and declarative, a public acknowledgment of their bond. She took it without hesitation, the touch a spark that ignited the culmination of months of tension, fear, and whispered longing. "You have endured what few could bear," he said softly, eyes fixed on hers, "and yet you have emerged not only unbroken, but more luminous for every trial. I cannot, will not, allow you to stand unrecognized in a world so blind to true merit." Clara's throat tightened, tears prickling her eyes, but this time they were tears not of shame, but of triumph, a validation of the dignity she had carried quietly through years of judgment. The storm outside mirrored the intensity within the hall, the wind thrashing against the panes, rain cascading in sheets like silver threads pulled from the heavens themselves. Clara felt the pulse of life in Somerset Manor, the electricity of truth revealed, the quiet power of resilience that could withstand ridicule and envy alike. Nathaniel drew her close, their foreheads nearly touching, and whispered words that were intended for no ears but her own. "From this night forward, let none tell you that you are anything less than extraordinary. I have loved you not for the world's measures, but for the unwavering grace of your soul." Her lips quivered, a faint, tremulous smile forming as the tension of years eased from her shoulders. She realized that the trials, the whispers, the cruel sketches and envious smiles had been the anvil upon which her courage was forged, and now she stood, radiant and resolute, as both participant and victor in the quiet war of dignity versus derision. The hall, the assembly, the world itself seemed suspended for a heartbeat, acknowledging the triumph of character over superficiality, of courage over cruelty. Yet the final echo of drama arrived as a servant, pale-faced and breathless, handed Nathaniel a folded missive. He opened it with a measured hand, scanning the contents, and a shadow crossed his expression. Clara's pulse quickened. Even in the triumph of the evening, the world had not relinquished its ability to test them, to demand further courage and resolve. He folded the paper slowly, eyes lifting to hers, and for the first time that night, Clara perceived the subtle tension of uncertainty, a reminder that love and triumph were never entirely unchallenged. Nathaniel tightened his grip on her hand, a silent promise that whatever new trials awaited, they would face them together. Clara drew in a steadying breath, feeling the surge of hope and fear intertwine, realizing that victory was not merely the absence of ridicule, but the courage to meet every storm, every whisper, every judgment with dignity and steadfastness. And in that quiet understanding, as the wind howled outside and the candles flickered with resilient flame, she allowed herself to hope, and to wonder, with trembling anticipation, what challenges yet awaited beyond Somerset Manor's walls, and whether their love, newly declared and fiercely defended, could endure whatever storms remained.